In Jewish law, not everything counts. For example, Jews are not allowed to eat pork, and if they do, they can be held liable and punished by a court. However, there's a minimum amount at which this liability applies. If a Jew eats less than a kezayit, which is about the size of an olive, it's still forbidden and they're still accountable before God, but they wouldn't be liable to punishment by a court. Why is this? Because Jewish law has minimum thresholds, minimum points at which an action becomes legally significant, at which an action becomes liable before a court. But here's the question. Do these minimum thresholds also apply to non-Jews, or just to Jews? In Maimonides' Laws of Kings and Wars, where he codifies Noahide law, Maimonides writes, minimum amounts apply only to Jews. And this is rooted in the Talmud. In Eruvin 4a, the Gemara says that measurements, in Hebrew shiurim, are halacha leMoshe miSinai. In English, laws transmitted to Moses at Mount Sinai. In general, when the Talmud says halacha leMoshe miSinai, laws transmitted to Moses at Mount Sinai, it usually refers to laws transmitted orally to only Israel at Mount Sinai. And they're usually part of the Torah's internal legal system. Unlike the Noahide laws that were given to Adam and then to Noah and then to Moses at Mount Sinai, these laws were transmitted only to Moses at Mount Sinai, not to Adam and to Noah. And so measurements, these shiurim, are part of this precise legal structure that was given only to Israel. So let's define this measurement, and then we'll see how it applies to non-Jews. The Hebrew word is shiur, and in Jewish law, a shiur is a fixed legal threshold. It's the point at which something becomes legally significant. Below that point, the act is still forbidden, but it may not carry full legal consequences in a court. And of course, above that shiur, above that point, the action does become liable before a court. And this doesn't just apply to food. Minimum thresholds appear in many other areas, like monetary law, for example. Below a certain amount, theft is still wrong, but it wouldn't be prosecuted by a court. Above that amount, it becomes a full legal violation. And remember, this is just only to Jews. So these shiurim, these amounts, are how Jewish law draws the line between legally significant and legally insignificant. But what about for non-Jews? As we stated earlier, non-Jews are not commanded in minimum amounts. Non-Jews were not given fixed legal thresholds. So in many cases, even a very small act can be considered legally significant. For example, a non-Jew who eats from a limb taken from a living animal, even just a small amount, can be held fully liable. But here's an important clarification. Just because non-Jews were not given fixed divine numerical thresholds, it doesn't mean that non-Jews shouldn't establish fixed thresholds for practical reasons for society. For example, consider the age of liability, which is the point at which somebody can become liable for their actions before a court. Jewish law has defined the minimum age for boys at 13 and for girls at 12. But these are minimum amounts transmitted to Moses at Mount Sinai, not to the entire world. So if non-Jews don't have minimum amounts, then what should we do? Well, many rabbis have asserted that it should just go on moral understanding. This is that point at which Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They became fully liable for their actions. So in theory, an 11-year-old non-Jew who has moral understanding can be held liable before a court, but a 14-year-old non-Jew who doesn't have moral understanding wouldn't be fully liable before a court. Yet in practice, moral understanding is hard to measure, hard to explicitly define. And so right now, it seems like society should just establish a fixed minimum threshold for clarity and consistency. And of course, this is allowed because this would uphold justice and make the world more inhabitable, less chaotic. And so the same also applies to Noahide judges. We can put the fixed threshold at 13 when somebody becomes liable, and this is when they would become liable in the obligation to establish courts of justice. But would we really want a 13-year-old judging our societies? There are several reasons why we probably wouldn't. And so it would make sense for a Noahide society, again, to establish a fixed legal threshold for one to be able to become a Noahide judge. A functioning legal system requires structure, and this is intuitive and obvious. But as for other laws, like eating the limb from a living animal, any amount is obviously sufficient. God said we shouldn't eat from a living animal. Eating means eating. So any amount that we eat makes us liable. So to close, unlike the Jews, non-Jews were not given fixed legal minimums, the exact numbers and amounts for when an action becomes fully liable before a court. These precise minimum thresholds were only given to Moses at Mount Sinai, not to Adam and to Noah. So when we non-Jews are commanded not to eat the limb from a living animal and not to steal, any amount goes. The focus is on the act itself. And this kind of makes sense. The Noahide laws are the basic universal requirements for a just, orderly society. They are the minimum thresholds in themselves. They don't necessarily come with the same intricate precision like God has set for Israel. The entire structure of Israel's legal system is set by God, while the nations have more discretion in some areas. So I hope this video clarifies what Maimonides means when he says that minimum amounts apply only to Jews. Stay tuned for more videos on Noahide law, which will be the legal system of the future. Thank you, as always, for watching.